Martayo, and welcome to our video on non-traditional research outputs. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Naomi Stead, who's Professor of Architecture here at Monash University. Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
Naomi, we're here to talk about non-traditional research outputs, or NTROs, as they're called. And I wonder if you could start by telling us what NTROs are.
Yes, non-traditional research outputs, a very ugly acronym, really. I suppose the first thing to say is that the emphasis there is on output, because there's a school of thought that says there's no such thing as traditional research and non-traditional research. There's just research.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that it is manifest in the world as an output does vary. So we all know what traditional outputs are. They are books, journal articles, book chapters. They have tended to be textual, historically speaking, but they don't have to be. Whereas non-traditional outputs are also the result of a systemic, rigorous research process, but they manifest in the world in different forms. And those forms might be creative forms, for example, artworks or works of architecture, built work, or indeed unbuilt work. But I guess the ones that I've been more involved with have to do with exhibition curation, forms of writing which are not conventional scholarship, but other forms of writing. And also research outputs which are specifically and particularly aimed at impact in the world. So for example, industry guides, research-based policy documents, things like that. So it's not like when you're doing research, you're thinking, oh, I'm doing non-traditional research, or, you know, there are degrees of conventionality and traditionalism of different types of research. But really, I suppose the non-traditional refers to the form in which it appears.
Okay. So it could actually be, you know, in a given project, you could have some, you know, more traditional or sort of published outputs as well as NTROs, all coming from the same project. Yeah.
And in fact, that's commonly the case. And in fact, some would say very desirable. You know, I've noticed a shift in PhD candidates in recent years that, you know, when I started my career thousands of years ago, I guess there was more of a bias towards, certainly in my discipline, which is architecture, there was more of a bias towards traditional methods and traditional outputs. They were primarily textual. There was a strong bias towards history and theory style projects, but that has really changed. So nowadays, PhD students and universities, I should say, not to mention Commonwealth governments, are very much interested in the effect that research has in the world. And I think for that reason, PhD students are increasingly leaning towards non-traditional outputs, which, let's face it, can be more effective than effective having impact than a journal article, which is one amongst literally millions of journal articles, and, you know, sadly, sometimes doesn't get widely read. So I think the reason why non-traditional research outputs are useful for PhD students is because they are often quite impact-oriented, and that's good. They can be very high profile. They can be very accessible in a way that conventional scholarly third-person, conventional scholarship and conventional scholarly forums or vehicles, let's say, particular journals, particular publishers, non-traditional research outputs can reach a much larger audience potentially. So I think that is the way the wind is blowing in terms of research in Australia. And I think there's a huge potential for PhD students to engage in the benefits of non-traditional research outputs. Because let's just assume that PhD students are looking to build their CVs, they're looking to have people read their research, they're looking to have it have an impact in the world, and they're also looking to impress a potential hiring panel.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, it can be enormously important. You know, if you have a non-traditional research output that's been read by large numbers of people and had an impact in the world, it's important. I mean, there's very importantly this sort of, let's say, subset or part of non-traditional research, which is about creative practice. So, you know, once again, creative practice is not just about, I don't know, sitting down and having something appear from, out of the blue. It has to be part of a systemic process, investigating a particular kind of thing, and it has to result in new knowledge. So it's conceivable that you might be doing an architecture practice or indeed an art practice, which does not result in new knowledge. So not all architectural practice or art practice results in a legitimate non-traditional research output. However, often it does. So, and if you are able to articulate where the new knowledge lies in your built work, your film, your painting, whatever, post-medium artwork, then it may be that the kind of creative research process has resulted in a non-traditional research output, which is absolutely a legitimate manifestation of new knowledge. And there you go. That's a very important part, I think, of non-traditional research.
And that means sort of anchoring that work in the literature, in the practice that comes before, in your methodology, you know, in your process of sort of developing the work, just like you do for more traditional outputs. So there's still that kind of larger field that you're situating yourself within and seeking to advance.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an interesting distinction in that traditional research will often have a question, you know, like a specific research question that it sets out to investigate. I mean, the classic humanities model is that you start with one question, you go through a long inquiry about that, and then you end up with a different question. Creative research will often not necessarily have an articulated, explicit question. It will have a thing that's investigated and the question emerges. So there is a difference in the way that different types of research take place, obviously.
Can you, you know, give me a few, you know, one or two instances, perhaps in your own research and your own practice, where an NTRO has really kind of been an output of the work?
Yes, I mean, I've done a lot. I mean, I'm a fairly non-traditional person, as it happens, and I've done a lot of non-traditional research outputs throughout my career. So I guess the type that I started earliest and have done most comprehensively is commissioned architectural criticism. So we can see this as a subset of art criticism or cultural commentary, or, you know.
Right.
And what that has tended to be is where an editor usually comes to me and says, well, will you write about this building? And I'm going to publish it in a professional magazine. Let's say Architecture Australia or some other journal that's pitched at a generalist audience, but also at architects. And then, so I would, you know, research that project fairly conventionally. I would talk to people, interview them. I'd do a lot of reading about the typology, blah, 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 blah. But then there's also the kind of creative work of crafting a piece of writing, usually fairly short, which is accessible and interesting, has something new to say, manifests some new knowledge, and then ends up in a magazine. So I've done a lot of that over the years, and I would say it's been very good for me, both because I enjoy doing it. It's enjoyable writing for a non-academic audience.
Yeah.
And it's quite high profile. So, and it means you get to write about important cultural works. You know, and I've been sort of flown around the country to write about things as well. So it's, you know, there are some extrinsic benefits as well as the intrinsic ones. So that's one type of thing, architectural criticism, which, you know, under the ERA guidelines is framed as non-traditional textual creative work. Very cumbersome definition, but nevertheless a definition. Another example would be exhibitions. So both in terms of exhibition curation, perhaps last year, perhaps the year before, I was involved with an exhibition at the RMIT Design Hub called Workaround, which was a kind of extravaganza, really. So I was one of the curators along with Fleur Watson and Kate Rhodes. There were a number of different contributors to that exhibition. So that was a work of curation, but curation itself is legitimate research work and it can manifest new knowledge. So that's one thing, exhibition curation. But there is also the production of material which then goes into an exhibition. So I've also done that along with a number of other collaborators at the Tin Sheds Gallery in Sydney, an exhibition called Portraits of Practice at Work in Architecture. And that was a kind of culmination of work that I've been doing for many years around gender equity in the architecture profession, but also the image of the architect. So the gendered, you know, racialized image of the architect, and the fact that the profession is in fact more diverse than it is thought to be. It's thought to be a kind of domain of white men in their 60s, but actually it's very diverse. It's just, you know, that's often not recognized. So that show was quite a big show. It was once again a commission show. There was a budget that came from the gallery itself, and it was a manifestation of research. It kind of was a was a way of showing work that we, data that we had been collecting over some years. And then the third example, specific practical example I could give is policy, sort of industry reports and guides, which interestingly enough are still regarded as non-traditional work. So they're very much based on research, but they're also framed into a format and a form that will be useful in industry. And the ones that I'm thinking of are the Parlour Guides to Equitable Practice. So Parlour is an organisation that I was a co-founder of. It's about, it's a research-based advocacy organisation looking to further the aims of gender equity in the architecture profession internationally. And the Parlour Guides to Equitable Practice were intended to be used in practices to help them. There are 11 of them. I was co-author. I have a number of co-authors, including Justine Clark and others, Susie Ashworth. It's won a lot of awards, the Parlour Guides to Equitable Practice, and they've been widely taken up and indeed widely copied, which is the sign of, frankly, the university system doesn't really know what to make of them. I mean, they're obviously good because otherwise they wouldn't have won so many awards, but they don't really fit within conventional research accounting structures. But nevertheless, they can be seen as non-traditional research outputs. Guides, they're manuals, basically.
Yeah. So that is a really, fascinating spread of different forms that NTROs can take. It's quite a big category of different stuff, isn't it? I'm quite interested in how NTROs could potentially both exhibit or present the outcomes of research processes, as you've sort of explained, but also how they might be part of how design ethnography is actually taken forward as a methodology. So we're not just saying, here's the work, have a look at it, but we're actually using NTROs as a way of doing research in a kind of ethnographic way. And you mentioned sort of an example of an exhibition where that had taken place. Could you maybe talk about that and how we might bring design ethnography and NTROs together, in a sort of ongoing kind of way as a methodology?
Yes. I mean, this is a really exciting area of work, I think, and it's one of the great potentials of design ethnography. And it really foregrounds the reflexivity of the researcher and their position in the work. But also that knowledge is constantly in the state of becoming. You never have a final thing, really. Everything is kind of provisional. And just because it's been written in a book doesn't mean it's finished and closed. So I think that where an output is also a kind of research instrument for gathering new knowledge or even, modifying the kinds of questions that you might have initially put forward, co-creating findings with the audience. It's a real potential, which might also be seen as an action research project.
Yeah.
So the example I was thinking of it's not me, I didn't do it, but it was Timothy Moore and sibling, his architecture practice sibling, curated another exhibition. Actually, it was related to work around, but it was called New Agency. And it was about attitudes towards aging and agency and aging, like how people felt about their own old age and how they were planning to take control of how they would live as they aged. And it was a presentation of a whole lot of data and ideas and models and examples and case studies and you name it, like very interesting work, but it was also surveys and events and a process of actively gathering new data, which would then, of course, add to and augment and also change the findings that were originally put forward in the exhibition. So that's a really good example. And I mean, there are many other examples, but where you see the research output as itself a kind of instrument or tool for gathering research.
Well, Naomi, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really lovely conversation. Thank you for listening, everybody, and for joining our video.